be some names I can't read. And it's a long one, so settle back. This is from 2 Kings, chapter 4, and it's the whole of chapter 4, and it's titled at the top of this one, The Widow's Oil Multiplied. One of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, has died. You know that your servant feared the Lord. Now take the creditor who is coming to take my 2 children as his slaves." Now the creditor is coming to take my 2 children as his slaves. Elisha asked her, "What can I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" She said, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go out and borrow empty containers from all your neighbors. Do not get just a few. Then go in and shut the door behind you and your sons and pour oil into these containers. Set the full ones to one side." So she left. After she had shut the door behind her and her sons, they kept bringing her containers, and she kept pouring. When they were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another container." But he replied, "There aren't any more." Then the oil stopped. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go and sell the oil and pay your debt. You and your sons can live on the rest." And then there's another one. One day, Elisha went to Shunem. A prominent woman who lived there persuaded him to eat some food. So whenever he passed by, he stopped there to eat. Then she said to her husband, "I know that the one who often passes by here is a holy man of God. So let's make a small walled-in upper room and put in a bed and a table and a chair and a lamp there for him. And whenever he comes, he can stay there." The Shunammite woman's son is the next one. And it says, one day he came from there and he stopped at the upstairs room to lie down. He orders his attendant, Gehazi, "Call this Shunammite woman." So he called her and she stood before him. Then he said to her son, "Say to her, 'Look, you've gone to all this trouble for us. What can we do for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?' She answered, 'I'm living among my own people.' So he asked her, 'Then what should be done for?' Her son answered, 'Well, she has no son.'" No, Gehazi answered and said, "Well, she has no son and her husband is old." "Call her," Elisha said. So Gehazi called her, and she stood in the doorway. Elisha said, "At this time next year you will have a son in your arms." Then she said, "No, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your servant." The woman conceived, gave birth to a son at the same time the following year, as Elisha had promised. And the next one. The child grew, and one day went out to his father in the harvest and the harvesters. Suddenly he complained to his father, my head. His father told the servant, "Carry him to his mother." So he picked him up and took him to his mother. The child sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut him in and left. She summoned her husband. "Please send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys so I can hurry to the man of God and come back again." But he said, "Why go to him today? It's not a new moon or a Sabbath. Is it not new moon or a Sabbath?" She replied, "Everything's all right." Then she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, "Go fast. Don't slow the pace for me unless I tell you." So she came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to his attendant, Gehazi, "Look, here's the Shunammite woman. Run out and meet her and ask, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your son all right?'" And then she answered, "Everything's all right." When she came up to the man of God at the mountain, she clung to his feet. Gehazi came to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone. She is in severe anguish. And the Lord has hidden it from me. He hasn't told me." Then she said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I say, 'Do not lie to me'?" So Elisha said to Gehazi, "Tuck your mantle under your belt, take my staff with you, and go. If you meet anyone, don't stop to greet them. And if a man greets you, don't answer him. Then place my staff on the boy's face." The boy's mother said to Elisha, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself lives, I will not leave you." So he got up and followed her. Gehazi went ahead of them and placed the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or sign of life. So he went back to meet Elisha and told him the boy didn't wake up. When Elisha got to the house, he discovered the boy lying dead on his bed. So he went in, closed the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he went and lay upon the boy, put mouth to mouth, eye to eye, hand to hand. While he bent down over him, the boy's flesh became warm. Elisha got up, went into the house, and paced back and forth. Then he went up and bent down over him again. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha called Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite woman." He called her, and she came. Then Elisha said, "Pick up your son." She came, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground, and she picked up her son and left. When Elisha returned to Gilgal, there was a famine in the land. The sons of the prophets were sitting before him. He said to his attendant, "Put on the large pot and make stew for the sons of the prophets." One went out to the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine from which he gathered as many wild gourds as his garment would hold. Then he came back and cut them up into the pot of stew, but they were unaware of what they were. They were served some of the men to eat, but when they ate the stew, they cried out, "There is death in the pot, man of God," and they were unable to eat it. Then Elisha said, "Get some flour." He threw it in the pot and said, "Serve it to the people to eat." And there was nothing bad in the pot. A man from Baal-Shalisha came to the man of God with his sack full of 20 loaves of barley bread from the first bread of the harvest. Elisha said, "Give it to the people to eat." But Elisha's servant asked, "What? Am I to set this before 100 men?" "Give it to the people to eat," Elisha said, "for this is what the Lord says. They will eat, and they will have some left over." So he set it before them, and as the Lord had promised, they ate and had some left over.
This last week, all that seems to have been going through my mind is obedience. Every service I've come to this week has been about obedience, and knowing God is calling us to be obedient. And I think these readings again do exactly the same thing. They talk about obedience and where we're at with God. Not where He's at with us, but where we're at with Him. And sometimes we miss out. The widow with the oil was obedient. It sounds stupid. She's got a small vase full of oil, only small. And Elijah tells her to go get all the empty containers from their neighbours. And so sons start gathering the containers. And they take them into the house, they close the door behind them, and she starts pouring the oil out of this small vessel into these empty containers. And each container is filled. And as she fills them up, they put them to one side. And the sons bring another container and they fill it up and put it to one side. Until they've got a whole house full of containers, and none of the neighbours have any more containers left. All the containers that they could get hold of were full of oil. She'd been obedient to what Elijah had told her. Elijah had been obedient to what God had told him. And he passed it on to this lady and told her what to do. And she'd been obedient in doing what she'd been told. And she got an abundance. Why? Because of Elijah? No, but because of her obedience to what God wanted her to do. She'd gone to Elijah and asked him, what can I do? Her sons were going to be taken in slavery. That was a way of getting some money into the house. They were going to be working for somebody else. And she was afraid of that. And she went to God. Well, she went to Elisha, and Elisha changed that around by listening to what God wanted her to do. And by being obedient and saying, this is what God is telling me. Go and do it. And she went and did it. I think it's like what Tracy was saying this morning about shopping on a Sunday has consequences for other people. If we don't do what God is asking us to do, then it has consequences for other people. If Elijah hadn't listened to God and said to this lady, look, take your small jar of oil and pour it into all these empty containers, it would have had consequences for her and her sons. Didn't make any difference to Elijah. Elijah was just doing what he thought God wanted him to do. But he was being obedient to what God had told him. But if he hadn't been, it would have had consequences for that woman and for her sons. And so we have to remember the consequences that happen. We look at the next one. The Sunamite woman and her hospitality. She was very hospitable to Elijah. She wasn't of the same faith, but she recognized him as a man of God, a man that had a special relationship with his God, not hers, but with his God. And every time he went past her home, she gave him a meal, because she recognized him as a prophet and a man of God. She was faithful and obedient, and every time he went past, he was fed. And she said to her husband, we need to do something more for this man. And so they built him his own room on their house. They went the next step. Somebody of no faith, or not of no faith in what Elijah represented, but recognized who he was. So they built him somewhere to sleep. And so Elijah, when he was going past, he used the room to rest in. I think that there is something there to remind us. When people do things for us, we need to use them. So often we reject it because we say, oh no, I'm all right. I can carry on my own. We reject other people wanting to do things for us. But Elijah didn't. He accepted it. And eventually he said to the lady, is there anything I can do for you? And she was saying, no, there's nothing you can do for me. He said, but you've no children. This time next year, when I come back next year, you will have a child. and she thought he was taking the mickey. But again, Elijah being obedient. It says that her husband was too old. Again, we've heard this story many times with God. Her husband's too old, so they're not going to have children. But he goes back the following year, and she has a child. And she realizes that Elijah's God is God. He is the God of Israel. He is the God of the world. So much so that when her son dies, who does she go looking for? Elijah. But when she gets close to Elijah and Elijah's servant goes out to her and says, "Is there anything wrong?" What does she say? "Oh no, everything's all right. My husband's okay, I'm okay, our servants are okay, my son's okay." There was nothing wrong. And she gets to Elijah and she just drops to his feet and grabs hold of his feet. She wasn't going to tell the servant what was wrong. I don't think she was going to tell Elijah what was wrong, but she was just in anguish. And eventually she tells him. But this time Elijah just says, "God's not shown me what's wrong." See, God doesn't always show us what's wrong with somebody else. There are different things that God does at different times. Here's a man that had been shown about the vase of oil, told the widow to pour it out into other things. He'd seen that this woman was going to have a child in a year's time. And yet, when the child dies, he sees nothing. Because God didn't want to reveal it to him, because he wanted the woman to tell Elijah what was wrong. If Elijah had seen, he would have just gone straight away and sorted things out. But that's not what God wanted. And the woman says that she's not going to leave Elijah's side. So Elijah has to go. He wants to just send his servant with his staff, because Elijah believes that when the servant puts the staff on the boy, he will be healed. But the woman says, "I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to stick with you." And so Elijah says, "Okay, let's go." The servant runs on ahead and he puts the staff on. Nothing happens. Well, it didn't need to happen, because Elijah's had to get up and go. He might have told his servant, "Don't bother with this stick, I'll take it myself." But also, I think there's two things in this. The servant was obedient and did what Elijah had told him. But also, Elijah was obedient, because he'd sent his servant and done what God had told him to do. And then we get to the point where Elijah gets there because the servant can't do a thing. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? You remember Jesus and the disciples? He comes down off the mountain. The disciples have been trying to drive out a demon. "Why can't we do it?" "Oh, you have little faith." But here, Elijah goes into the room, closes the door so there's only him and the boy in the room. And he lays on the boy, hand to hand, eye to eye, mouth to mouth. It's just giving you a picture of him laying on the boy. And it just reminds me of a picture of the cross. You know, if you're going to put your hands on somebody's hands and lay on them, you've got to pull them out slightly. And when you've got your nose on their nose and your eyes on their eyes, it's a picture of the cross. and how God cares for us. And the boy starts to get warm, but doesn't come round. And Elijah gets, to me, it sounds like he's got impatient. He leaves the room and he goes to the room downstairs and he's pacing up and down. You know, what do I do next? So I can just imagine him. What am I going to do next? The boy's got warm, but he hasn't come round. What do I do, God? What do I do? And he goes back upstairs and he does exactly the same thing again. And the boy sneezes 7 times and comes back to life. What a change in that family. But you see, there's only one problem. There's only one person knew that the boy was dead. And that was the wife, his mother. Because she didn't tell his father that he died. She didn't tell any of the servants. She didn't tell Elisha's servant, although he knew because he'd been and put the staff on his head. But she was obedient. She did what she felt needed to be done. And she knew that Elijah could do something. We look at the loaves of bread. The guy brings all these barley loaves to Elijah, and Elijah just says, "Go and feed these men," to his servant. And his servant looks at him and says, "You must be off your rocker." Just like the disciples said to Jesus. "There ain't enough here to feed 100 men. And you're telling me to take them out?" Elijah says, "Do as you're told, just go and do it. And there'll be some left over because that's what God's told me." Again, Elijah being obedient. Instructing somebody to do something who then eventually has to be obedient. And when they both do it, they go feed the 100 men, and what happens? There are some left over. There are things left over. There's more than enough for everybody. Do you know, we serve a God that gives in abundance. And we so often don't recognize it. We can see it in our own church here. You've only got to go to the shop and he serves us in abundance. There's money comes into that shop, but it seems to come from nowhere. But there are things come into the shop because Lindsay prays for them. And when somebody comes in and says, "I need X, Y, or Z," she says, "Okay, come back in a couple of days." Obedience to God. And that's what Lindsay's been when she says that. She's been obedient to God. And what happens? Because she's been obedient, the things come. It's because of the obedience that things happen. And we sometimes wonder why God doesn't work. Sometimes it's because we're not being obedient. We're not listening to what he's asking us to do. Or when he asks us to do something, we say, "We can't do that." Or we're not going to do that because it's stupid. We're not going to take 5 loaves and 2 fishes out to 5,000 people because they'll slaughter us. We don't go in obedience. And because we don't go in obedience, then how is God going to work? Because we stop him. Because we haven't got that obedience to do what he's telling us to do. Sometimes he just gives us an instruction like he'd been giving Elijah. Go and say this to this person. Then they've got to be obedient. Elisha had been obedient. He'd done what God had told him to do. He told the person what they needed to do. But it's obedience in both cases. Elijah was obedient. the woman with the oil was obedient. The next chapter goes on to the soldier that had a skin disease. And again you see obedience in that chapter. You can read that one for yourself. It's a great story. Great warrior. They have a slave in the kingdom where he's at, and the slave girl tells her mistress, who tells the king, who tells his commander, go and see this man. And he gives him silver and clothes and all sorts of stuff, lots of wealth, to take to the king in Israel. He gets to the king in Israel. The king in Israel panics and tears his clothes because he thinks this other king's trying to set him up. And Elijah hears about it, goes, sees the king, and says, what are you worried about? Just send him to me. You know what God's given me to do. Send him to me. And so the king sends this soldier to Elijah. Elisha doesn't even come out of the house. He has the gall to send his servant out to this man. And this is an official of the other kingdom. Somebody really special. You know, we set people up on pedestals. But Elijah didn't. He sent his servant out to see him. Go tell him to nip down to the Jordan and dip himself in the Jordan 7 times. The official, the soldier, gets irate and said, I'm off home. We've got better rivers where I've come from than the Jordan. It's just a mucky, terrible river. It looks filthy. I'm not getting myself in that. And he says that until his servant tells him. But if you tell one of your soldiers what to do, what do? They do it. Go and do it. You're only dipping yourself in a river 7 times. And so he listens and he goes and he dips himself in the river 7 times. And he's healed. And then he comes back to Elijah and says, I want to give you something for my healing. What's Elisha say? No. I don't need any payment. Don't give it to me. Don't look at me. It wasn't me. My Father in heaven. Points him back to God. You know, if you're going to work for God, don't take the praise. Give it where it's due. Mother Teresa is one story that springs to mind. She'd been preaching in this cathedral that was full of people. And when she'd finished preaching, somebody brought this beautiful bouquet of flowers up to her. And they gave it to her. And she took the flowers and she turned around and walked up to the altar and placed them on the altar. And started to walk back. And the person says, no, they're for you. And she said, no, anything I do is from God. And so therefore, the gift belongs to him, not to me. I think too often the flowers come to us and we go, thank you very much. These are really lovely. And we accept the praise of people rather than giving them back to where they should be. Because the honour is not ours. Any time we're honoured for doing something that God has told us to do, that honour doesn't belong to us. It belongs to him. And we're only working, or should be working, through his obedience, through our obedience to him. When God tells you to do something, if you're obedient, things will happen. But when we're disobedient, it won't. What happened with the servant suddenly saw all this stuff, ran after the soldier. He ran after the soldier and said, whoa, 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 whoa. We could use that stuff. We can make use of it. Let us have, because there's two people that we can give the stuff to. He was totally disobedient. And what happens? Elijah turns around to him and says, because of your disobedience, you will suffer what he had. You and your family will suffer the skin disease that this man had. And so it happens that that's the way it goes. Obedience is important. Don't let it go out of your head any other way. Obedience is important. You know, today, we so often get, especially from our youngsters, I used to get quite often at college, you have to earn my respect. I used to get a long lecture about it, but you have to earn my respect. We don't look. Obedience is not around these days. See, my lecture would have been, in short, no, I don't have to earn your respect. My position gives me your respect. You might not like me. That's a different ball game. I may have to work so that you like me, but my respect comes from my position, not from whether you think I deserve it or not. But we have to respect our God. And too often we don't, because we're not obedient to him. If we're disobedient, we're disrespectful. And we live in a society these days that's disrespectful. And I think that's why it's really important that we get back to our grassroots and get back to the respect of our God and our Father that we need. And I think it's one of the reasons that when we talk about that survey, that churches are growing, because they've got back to the respect of a Father and what he requires from us. We need that respect. To get that respect, it means being obedient. Are we obedient to what God is telling us? It's so easy to be disobedient. It's so easy to get into the ways of the world and do what the world does. We need to change. We need to be different. We need to show people that we're different, just like Elijah did. But when we show people we're different and we're obedient to God, it's amazing what things will happen. People will have jars of oil, and they will be filled from one small jar. People will see bread multiplied. People will see people healed. It didn't just happen in Jesus' time, it happened before. God did it before, he did it at the time of Jesus, and he's doing it today. Same yesterday, today, and forever. God does not change. The world may change, but God does not change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. We need to be obedient. Amen.
because it wasn't my turn, so it doesn't matter if I forgot. But please remember, if you need prayer, don't go home from here until you get prayer. And if you feel you need some privacy, there's many a room around. Just ask John, one of the elders, anybody, if you need prayer this morning. Don't go home without it. And I will sing our last song, please.